A little bit different this morning. I don't know if you can still see the first couple of rows, but everyone moved up on us. So thankful for that we actually get to see one another now. You know, I get to look them directly in the eyes. They're not so far back there where I can't see that well. So make me a little nervous this morning too. So we'll get through it with God's help. So hopefully you brought up your Bibles with you because we are in Joshua chapter 11. One thing that you'll probably notice is since we don't have it up on the screen, you know, we have taken the scripture off of our projector right now. And I told Stephanie yesterday, I said, I think it's almost a good thing because that means people have to get into the Word. So if you don't have a Bible, feel free to go ahead and grab one if you would like. But we are in Joshua chapter 11 this morning. Last week we finished up chapter 10 and we saw the rest of the battle between Israel and the 5 kings that came against them. And we saw how this looked like an extremely hard challenge that was coming at them, but they were able to win that battle because God was fighting for them. And we have to remember that this has been God's fight all along. Israel was just the tool that God was using to accomplish it. So, now this morning as we get into chapter 11, you know, I'll tell you that this chapter really encouraged me this week. At first glance, it probably will not sound like a very encouraging chapter. Because when we read through it, we're going to see more battles. We're going to see more enemies, more conflict. And this is probably the biggest challenge that Israel has had to face so far. But the more that I sat with this chapter, the more that I thought through it, the more I realized just how relatable this chapter really is. And I know I've mentioned before, but you know, one of the main reasons I felt led for us to go through the book of Joshua is because in a lot of ways it reminds me of where we are as a church. When you read Joshua, yes, we're reading about battles, we're reading about wars and enemies, but underneath all of that, you're watching a people learn how to trust God. They're facing things that are bigger than themselves. They're stepping into situations where they don't have all of the answers. And they're learning how to walk by faith, and they're doing it together. Now let me say this because I don't want anybody to misunderstand what I mean. Because as a church, we are not running into battle with swords and shields. You know, hopefully I can get an amen out of that. You know, I hope and pray none of us want to ever do that. I will leave that for Joshua in their day. I do not ever want to run into battle with swords and shields. That is not me. We are not fighting armies with horses and chariots like we're going to see today. You know, that's not what I'm saying at all when I say this reminds me of us. What I'm saying is we face challenges. We face many unknowns. We face situations where we look ahead and we wonder, Lord, I don't know how we're going to get through this. I mean, one example that I think of almost every single day right now has been our roof. I think about that, and I know you guys probably think about it just as much as I do, you know. When you look at something from our perspective, you know, it's easy to think, how in the world are we going to do this? You know, and that's just one of the challenges that lays ahead of us, and man, that looks like a challenge that is way bigger than us, right? But I think this is why Joshua has been speaking to me so much, because by the time we get to chapter 11, you know, especially if you've been with us through the series, you know that Joshua and the people of Israel, they have been through a lot. They've fought battles, they've won some victories, and they've got to watch God do things for them that only God can do. But after everything that they've already faced, because they have done so much, and after everything, they look up and they realize that they still face their greatest challenge ahead of them. And sometimes I think that's where we are too. This past week on May 18th, it marked 1 year since I officially became the pastor here. And, thank you. So this week I've really taken the time to kind of reflect and think about this past year. And I think about all the work that has already gone into this place. We've cleaned things up. We've painted rooms. We've worked on projects. We've rearranged things. We've fixed things that haven't been touched in years. We had to clean up dust that was older than me, so probably twice my age. So we've cleaned some things around here. And little by little, we've started building this foundation that I truly believe will help us as we move forward. And I think about that all the time. I think about all of that, all of the progress that we made, and I thank God for the progress that's already been made here. I really do. And I'm thankful for every single person that has helped, every single person that has encouraged, every person that has supported, everyone who has given their time and their energy because they love this church and they want to see God continue working here. And one of the things that encourages me the most right now is every time I walk into the sanctuary and I see our cross lit up above the baptistry, I just love it. I love seeing that when I walk in and, when I get to see it all lit up, I'm just filled and so encouraged every time that I see it. And I know that the guys that helped with that project, they all remember everything that went into it. They might even still be feeling it a little bit, They might still feel it. We had to scrape the mural down. They had to skim coat the walls. We had to prime it and paint it. We spent hours standing on a ladder, and by the time you got down, your legs felt a little bit shaky, and then when you laid down that night, you felt like you were still standing on that ladder. And just about everything that we had to do, we were doing it with our arms kind of above our heads. So that's why I said maybe your shoulders are still feeling it because, man, it was rough. There was a lot more work behind that project than what a lot of people probably realize. But now when you walk in and you get to see the finished product, it reminds you that all the work was worth it. And I think sometimes it's good for us to stop and to thank God for the victories that He's already given us instead of focusing on everything that still needs to be done. Because yes, we all know that there is still things ahead of us. There are still challenges, there are still projects, there are still things that look overwhelming to us. But I don't say that this morning as someone who is discouraged. It's actually the opposite. I am so encouraged. Because when I look around this church, I don't see a church that's standing still. I don't think that we're just sitting here in the pews and waiting, for this place to close or waiting to see, what God is going to do. I see people who care. I see people who love this place just as much as I do. I see people willing to help however they can because they want to see God continue working here. And I truly believe that God is still working here. I have been so encouraged when I look around it and I see us moving. That is the most encouraging thing to me. The worst thing that you would see, and I know when you go to Revelations and you read all the letters to the churches, the worst thing is a lukewarm church that isn't doing anything. That's the worst thing, is if we just stood still and that's it. But we're not. We are moving. It might seem a little bit slow, but hey, progress is progress. I think that we need to celebrate and, be thankful for all the little wins that we have. The more that I've studied through Joshua, the more that I've realized that sometimes God allows His people to stand in front of things that are bigger than them because it reminds them to depend on Him completely. If we could do everything ourselves, we probably wouldn't pray like we should. We probably wouldn't rely on God like we should. But when you stand in front of something that feels impossible, it makes you lean on him in a completely different way. And I think that's exactly where Joshua is in this chapter. They've already seen some victories. They've already seen a lot of progress. They were told that they were going to go in and take all of the promised land. They've seen a lot of progress. But now they're looking ahead and they see that there's even more battles waiting ahead of them. So, with all that in mind, let's go ahead and we're going to read Joshua chapter 11. We're going to read it from beginning to the end together. So, starting in verse 1, Joshua chapter 11, and it says, "And it came to pass, when Jabin, king of Hazor, had heard those things, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Ashaph, and to the kings that were on the north of the mountains and of the plains south of Chinneroth, and in the valley and in the borders of Dor on the west, and to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and to the Amorite, and to the Hittite, and to the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the mountains, and to the Hivite under Hermon, and the land of Mizpeh. And they went out, they and all their hosts with them, much people, even as the sand that is upon the seashore in multitude, with horses and chariots very many. And when all these kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And the Lord said unto Joshua, Be not afraid because of them. For tomorrow about this time will I deliver them up all slain before Israel. Thou shalt hoe their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua came and all the people of war with him against them by the waters of Merom suddenly, and they fell upon them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who smote them and chased them unto Zidon and unto Mesrephoth-Maim, and unto the valley of Mizpeh, eastward, and they smote them until they left them none remaining. And Joshua did unto them as the Lord bade him. He hawked their horses and burnt their chariots with fire. And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, and he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all the kings of them did Joshua take and smote them with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only that did Joshua burn. And all the spoil of these cities and the cattle the children of Israel took for prey unto themselves, but every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, neither left they any to breathe. As the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took all that land, the hills and all the south country, and all the land of Goshen, and the valley, and the plain, and the mountain of Israel, and the valley of the same, even from the Mount Halak that goeth up to Sire, even unto Balgad, in the valley of Lebanon, under Mount Hermon. And all their kings he took, and smote them, and slew them. Joshua made war a long time with those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All other they took in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, and that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord commanded Moses. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, and Gath, and Ashdod there remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribe, and the land rested from war. After reading this passage, like I said at first glance, you probably wouldn't read this and say, man, I really walked away from here feeling so encouraged. It really took some time to kind of study this and see where they are and put yourself into the story to get to where you leave feeling encouraged. So I hope and pray that I can do it a little justice, and I hope that by the time you leave here today, you can feel just as encouraged as I do. After reading through this chapter, one of the first things that stands out is just how massive this battle was. Back in chapter 10, Israel was fighting against the 5 kings and their kingdoms, and that was in southern Canaan. That was the battle of the south. But now in chapter 11, it's almost like the entire north starts coming together against them. It's kingdom after kingdom joining this alliance against Israel. And the Bible describes this. And it says that the army was as the sand that is upon the seashore in multitude. Now, I don't know exactly how many people that is. I couldn't tell you. But when the Bible compares them to the sand on the seashore, you can just imagine that this was an overwhelming amount of people. And then on top of that, it mentions the horses and the chariots. That's a really important detail not to skip over, because horses and chariots, in their time, it represented military strength and power. Israel, they mostly fought on foot, and they had their swords and their shields, while these other nations that they were fighting would have been considered, they were fighting with advanced military equipment. So just picture being one of those Israelites. Just picture you are an Israelite. You are standing against all of these people, a multitude of people coming against you. You see just how massive this army is, and they have all of their horses and their chariots lined up against you. From a human perspective, this looked bad. I know that we've said before that some of these battles, it looked like an impossible task, but if there was ever one that truly looked impossible, this would be it. And you have to remember when we read this, we know how it ends. We can read the rest of the story. We can finish the book of Joshua, but Joshua didn't know that yet. The people didn't know yet. All they could see was this massive army standing in front of them. But I love what God says in verse 6. Be not afraid because of them. Before the battle even starts, God speaks. And that encouraged me so much this week, because when God already knew how all of this was going to play out. Joshua didn't know yet. Israel didn't know yet, but God did. God already knew the outcome before they ever even went into battle. And I think sometimes, we're a lot like Joshua here. There are moments in life where, we feel overwhelmed by what's standing in front of us. There are things that we face where we don't know how everything is going to work out. Sometimes all we can see is the problem. All we can feel is the pressure that's on us, and we see everything that seems stacked against us. But while we're sitting here worrying about it all, God already knows. God already sees the other side of it. God already knows how all of this is going to play out. Now, that doesn't mean that we always know what He's doing. It doesn't mean that we always understand why things happen the way that they do. And it doesn't mean that we always get the answer as quickly as we would like. But what it does mean is that God is not surprised by what we're facing. There is no challenge that stands before us that surprises God. And that's the one thing that I am learning more and more as time goes on. Our responsibility is not to figure out every little detail ahead of time. Our responsibility is to stay faithful and to follow where God leads us. That's what Joshua is doing here. This battle, it was bigger than anything that they've faced before. The enemy looked overwhelming. And from their perspective, it looked impossible. But God was already ahead of them. The same God that had brought them through every battle before this one, He was going to be faithful with this one too. It's going to be no different. And then another thing that really stood out to me in this chapter is how Joshua responds after God speaks to him. In verse 6, God tells Joshua, "Be not afraid because of them." And then in verse 7, it says, "So Joshua came." That really stuck with me this week. God tells Joshua not to be afraid, and then Joshua moves. He doesn't sit there demanding all the answers first. He's not saying, "Okay, God, you're telling me to move, but I'm just going to sit here in prayer until you tell me all the details of what's going to happen." God spoke, and Joshua moved forward by faith. And the more I thought about that, the more it challenged me personally this week. Because I'm the type of person, and I'm not afraid to admit it, I'm the type of person that can think about everything all at once. I know for some of you I've talked about projects, and my mind goes crazy because I think about this, I think about that, I think about all of these things that need to be done. That is where my mind goes. I think about everything. All the projects, I think about the future, I think about all the challenges, and man, how are we going to overcome this? I think about ideas, I think about ministry, I think about everything that still needs to be done. What I'm learning is that if you stare at all of it long enough, it can start to feel very overwhelming. But one thing that God has been showing me is that a lot of times He gives you just enough to know where the next step is. That's when you just take that step and you trust Him from there. You don't have to know every answer immediately. You don't have to see all the picture at once. A lot of times walking by faith simply means obeying God enough to just take that next step. That's what Joshua and Israel is doing here. He didn't know exactly how the battle was going to play out. All he knew was that God said, "Don't be afraid," and Joshua went. And I think about that, and I think that this is where we are as a church right now. We don't have all the answers about our future. We don't know exactly how every challenge ahead of us is going to work out. There are things ahead of us that are bigger than us. But we already know what God has called us to do. He's called us to spread the gospel, to make disciples, to love people, and to point them towards Christ. That part is already clear. We've already received our commission. And another thing that God has really been showing me through this passage is that sometimes, I spend so much time thinking about every detail and every possibility that I end up overwhelming myself before I ever start moving. And God has been teaching me that, I can't lead that way. We have to keep walking by faith. We need to keep seeking God's direction and trusting that He's going to lead us just like He already has. Because if we wait until we have all the answers, if we're saying, "Well, I have to know everything before I move," we'll probably never move at all. It's like what I've heard, with people getting married and things like that. They're saying, well, or maybe having kids. That's another big one that I've heard. They said, well, if you're waiting for the right time, that right time will never come. If I'm sitting here with all of these ideas and I'm like, all right, God, show me everything, that right time may never come. Sometimes it's like those automated doors at the grocery store. You know, I thought about the automated doors at Walgreens when you walk up to it. The door doesn't open until you walk towards it. When you get close enough, then the door opens for you. I think sometimes God moves in those ways. You know, He's wanting us to step out on faith. Sometimes the answer doesn't come until you take the step that God has placed in front of you. That doesn't mean that we're careless. It doesn't mean that we don't plan and we just don't think things through. But there's a difference between planning wisely and being frozen because we're trying to solve everything before we even start. Joshua didn't do that. God said, "Be not afraid," and Joshua came. That is faith moving forward. And I think that's what God is calling us to do too. Not to know everything, not to have every answer, but to keep following Him with the light that He gives us. And then as I got to the end of this chapter, you know, there was a question that kept coming to my mind. Why do you think God brought them into this land and had them go through battle after battle after battle like this? Why do you think God would do that? Because we know that God could have handled this instantly if He wanted to. God could have wiped out every enemy before Israel ever stepped foot into this land. God didn't need Israel's help. He chose to use them. God didn't need swords. He didn't need all of these battles. So why bring them through all of this? And the more I thought about it, the more I believe that God was preparing them for something greater than just winning battles. God was building a people. He was teaching them to trust Him. He was teaching them to rely on Him. And He was teaching them how to walk by faith together. Because by the end of this chapter, you know, after all the battles and all the conflict, verse 23 says, "And the land rested from war." I love that verse. The goal was never just battle after battle. That was not the goal. God was bringing them somewhere. He was bringing them into the land that He had promised them. This was the land that was described as flowing with milk and honey. If you were to ask them in the midst of all these battles, they would probably not think that this is a land flowing with milk and honey. They would think that this is a land flowing with bloodshed because they have been battle after battle after battle. But that was never the goal. God brought them into this land, and He allowed them to face challenge after challenge because He was forming them as a nation. He was teaching them what it meant to live under His leadership and to depend on Him. And I think that's why Joshua has meant so much to me, you know, with everything that we've been going through as a church. Because underneath all of these battles, you're watching a people learn how to trust God together. You're watching a people face challenges and unknowns and all of these situations bigger than themselves, but through it all, God keeps moving them forward. And that's where the connection is for us. We're not Israel entering into Canaan. And we're not fighting the same kind of battles that they had fought. But we are a church learning how to trust God with what is ahead of us. We're a church learning how to walk by faith. We're a church learning that we need each other. And when I think about our church, I think about the roof, and I think about our future, and I think about everything that is still ahead of us. But then I look at Joshua, and I'm reminded that God never called His people to figure everything out. He called them to trust him. And I believe that's what we need to continue doing as a church. But I'll tell you this too. The more I've thought about our church lately, the more that I've realized something. What makes a church strong is not the building. It's the people. Now, don't misunderstand me. Buildings matter, projects matter, taking care of what God has given us matters. I fully believe that. That's why we have worked so hard on doing little improvements to this place. But at the end of the day, the church is us. It's people loving each other, praying for each other, encouraging one another. It's people who are serving together, growing together, and walking through life together. That's what I want for us. I want us to build a community together. I want us to spend time together. I want us to make memories together, and I want us to know each other and genuinely care about each other. Because that's what a church is supposed to be. Now, I'm not saying that we don't do that already. I think that we do a pretty good job at that already. But I also don't want us to sit around and say, well, when we get more people, then we'll start doing more things together. I don't think that's how we should look at it at all. We need to build community with the people that God has already placed here. I'm thankful for the people that God has given us. I really am. I'm thankful for each and every one of you. I don't want ministry to become a numbers game. I want us to connect with people. I want us to grow together as disciples. And I want us to be a church family where people can lean on one another. And they know that they're not walking through life alone. That's the kind of church I believe honors the Lord. I've talked with missionaries recently. I know I've mentioned that a couple of times, but I've heard about people in other countries who are hungry for the word. And some of them don't even have church buildings like we do. I walk in here all the time like, man, how blessed we are to have a space like this. Some of them in other countries, they meet quietly in homes. Sometimes they have to meet at night because if they get caught gathering together, they could get in some serious trouble. And yet some of those churches are flourishing. Some of them, they need more space. Why is a place like that growing so much? Because they don't even have a solid building over their head. It's because of the people. The people who passionately love Christ. The church has never been the building. I know I love this place. It's a place that I've grown up in since I was Sophie's age. You all know that. But I'll tell you, even if something, God forbid, happened to this building and say it wasn't here tomorrow, we are still a church. The church is not the building. The church is the people. And if we stay faithful to God, if we keep walking by faith, we keep loving one another, and we grow together, I believe that God can continue doing something special here. It's not because we're perfect. We're a group of imperfect people worshiping a perfect Savior. It's not because we have everything figured out, because if you talk to me long enough, you'll know that I don't have everything figured out. But it's because we are trusting Him together, and we are doing it one step at a time. I think it worked out perfect that you all moved up close this morning. It was meant to be. Thank you all for doing that. As we start to come to a close this morning, I hope through this chapter, you can see why it has left me so encouraged this week. Because yes, we can read through it and we can focus on just the battles. We can think about everything that they went through. Or we can look at it and say, okay, this was just another challenge waiting ahead of them, and we get to see a people following God in faith. You can kind of look at it from a different lens and say, okay, how does this apply to us? And I think this is one that just really spoke to me this week because, yes, we might have some crazy big challenges that wait ahead of us, but honestly, we don't have to worry about all of that. What we have to worry about on a day-to-day basis is following God and where He leads. They didn't know after all of this, what if there was another battle to come? After their battle at Jericho, they said, okay, great, what's next? After Ai, then, okay, what's next? They had these battles after battles, and guess what? They weren't thinking of, okay, well, this final battle that we're going to see, because this is the last chapter that is entirely focused on war and battles, is chapter 11. They weren't thinking about the end game, okay, well, we've got our largest challenge coming up next. They didn't think about it that way. They took it, okay, this is what is in front of us. What is God telling us to do? God led them through that. Another challenge came up. What is God telling us to do? And He kept moving them forward. I was really encouraged when I looked at it this week, and it took me a little bit of time to get there. So I hope I did it justice, and I hope I explained it well enough. Because when Joshua, when he was looking ahead at this next battle, and it was a multitude of people, all he could see was this overwhelming battle waiting for them. But God was already there ahead of them. And I think sometimes we need that reminder too. Sometimes with those overwhelming things, we think, oh, in the moment, but God's already ahead of that. He already knows our future. He's already there waiting for us. There are things that we're not going to be able to figure out on our own. But God has never asked us to carry those things alone. He asks us to trust Him. Maybe this morning there's something in your life right now. I know we talked about a church level and where God is going to lead us forward, but maybe on a personal level. Maybe there's something in your life right now that feels overwhelming. Maybe there's something that you've been carrying, something you've been worrying about, something, there's a fear about your future. Can I leave you with some encouragement this morning? God already knows what's ahead of you. He's already there. Sometimes faith is just simply saying, Lord, I don't have every answer, but I'm going to trust you with this next step. That's all we can do. This morning, if God has been dealing with your heart, if there is something that He has put on your heart, don't ignore it. You can come before Him and you can lay it all down at His feet. You can ask Him, Lord, I don't have all the answers. I don't know what to do with this challenge in my personal life that's ahead of me, but Lord, I know that I'm going to trust you. Maybe you want to come this morning and just be grateful. I'm so thankful for the little wins that we have had so far. I tell people all the time, we got to celebrate the little things because guess what? Little things add up to big things. It's one step at a time. We can't just go and attack the big things all at once, but just one step at a time. Maybe you're someone who's here this morning and maybe you've never stepped out to trust Him to begin with. Maybe you're somebody who's never just truly stepped out to make Him your Lord and Savior, and I'll let you know that today is always a great day. Every single day that we have is a great day to come to Him. So as we get a verse of invitation here in just a moment this morning, I just want you to know that this altar is open. You can come and pray. Whatever God has laid on your heart, this time is for you.